I'd love to hear more about that, if that's okay. Then we'll move on to some questions. Um,
Great. Cut to years later, I continued studying Portuguese. Obviously, I did Spanish and Portuguese, maintained both languages, and studied completely different things throughout my undergrad, working more with music and history and sort of biographical studies, but always with Machado as a companion. Um, and ever since my second semester of Portuguese, I'd been doing translations both from Spanish and from Portuguese to English, of all sorts of things, essays, film subtitles, the academic books. I mean, a lot of the first books that I translated were more scholarly works because it was, professors would recommend me to other professors. And one of those books was a work of literary criticism by João César de Castro Rocha, of UERJ, the State University of Rio. And it was a reading of Machado's works. And I took it on thinking, this will be my challenge here is to translate. I think if I'd thought that I was going to translate Machado, I don't know if I would have had the stomach to do it. I just thought I'm going to translate João César, who is a wonderful person, and I can talk to him, and he's alive, and he's not, one of these the greatest, masters of Brazilian literature of all times. And then as for Machado, he's quoting Machado all the time, but almost all of the stories have been translated, all the novels have been translated. This will just be hunt and peck, and I'll be able to fill in all the quotes. And immediately that started to go off the rails, mostly because of João César, because he just cites this immense breadth of chronicas and poetry and theater and obscure short stories and things that had never been translated before. So I was forced to get my feet wet. But what I found more disconcerting and unexpected was that in many cases I had to retranslate, even though I would turn up, he's analyzing a passage from Dom Casmurro, let's say. And I turn up all the existing translations of Dom Casmurro in English, and I try to plug them in one after the other and see, does this work? And just sometimes none of them worked with his critical reading, and not because they were off the mark, but because his reading was touching on such a specific element of Machado's syntax
mm,
or, his word choice, things that were hewing really close to the skin of the text. And so, in order for the book that I was translating to make sense, for João César not to look like a crazy man, I had to, either tweak existing translations or try to go back to the Portuguese and produce an entirely, new paragraph. And in some cases, especially around, I mean, Brás Cubas had always been very close to my heart. So when I was able to see that the existing translations, one sort of had this kind of a voice and the other had this kind of a voice. And as I was translating excerpts from it, I was like, I would really love to do this properly. I would really love to, instead of doing bit by bit, I would love to do it from start to finish and then arrive at, my decisions for this particular paragraph. Obviously, that was not feasible. João César could not put his book on hold while I went and translated the entire works of Machado de Assis. So I had to, consider those placeholders, very decent placeholders. But that was just before I was on a fellowship, and that was just before I was entering the PhD program at Brown. And I had originally had a completely different proposal for my dissertation, for my time at Brown. And over the course of this translation of João César's book, I just started mentally kind of putting it in a corner and thinking, what if I were able to, these are works that demand time and care and deep research, which are things that we never have. We never have time, and we never have care, and we never have the space for, almost never have the space for deep research. But, that's what a doctorate can provide. So when I came into Brown, I did a little switcheroo and said, what if I were to do a new translation of the Memórias Póstumas Brás Cubas, which would be so that eventually the translation that came out The translation that came out in the 2020 Penguin edition was one of the chapters of my dissertation, and the other chapters were sort of a biography of the book in English. So I did a full version of my translation without consulting the prior three translations, and then after I'd arrived at a decent draft that I felt was sort of uncontaminated, where I hadn't peeked at my fellows' papers. Then I went back and looked at them in order to characterize the style of each translator and see, who were these other people who came to this book in very different places and times, and what baggage do they bring to it. And then very often, some of the most beautiful and unexpected things happened when I was able to just cross-read, compare my translation to theirs and see where we diverged. Often because that is sort of I came to think of it as a treasure map for the places where Machado has laid banana peels, where he's laid, trapdoors, where he has created these knots of ambiguity where no one is plausibly right. We're just all in our divergence, we are symptoms of the complexity and the nuance that he's left latent in the text. And after as I was finishing throughout the process, so it took a couple of years, and I didn't know if it would be published, but as I was getting ready to defend my dissertation, I started talking with publishers, and I was frankly shocked and very pleased that Penguin was willing to take me on, as a PhD student with a big file under my arm. And now here we are.